growing up, I always thought it was kind of cool that I didn't have a normal granddad and grandma. By which I mean, on my mum's side of the family, I always had a Nine and a Taid, which, of course, I never questioned as a kid. That's just kind of, you take for granted, as you take as law, whatever you're told. But Nine and Taid are, of course, Welsh for grandma and granddad. And, of course, my mum's side of the family are very Welsh, properly Welsh, as they would have it, from about as far north and as far west as you can possibly get before running into the ocean. So right up on the Llyn Peninsula. And I always liked it. It was always there was always something very exciting about going up that way and going to visit them. Like, even now, the landscape is quite stark, and you really do feel like you're running off the edge of the world as you finally cross Wales and head down that extended spit pointing towards Ireland, and the land is, the country is narrowing on either side of you as you're slowly tapering off to a point. And that's where they live, right up on the edge of the world, and it does really feel remote. I mean, kind of growing up, this wasn't a problem, but certainly in later life, you notice utterly no phone signal. You are just completely detached from the world. Certainly no internet, obviously. And, still, to all intents and purposes, only 5 channels or so. I mean, not that, you can't get Sky or Freeview or any of, like, the many options of TV. It's just, they're of an age where they weren't never entirely, beyond a certain point, never entirely comfortable with technology. So, we tried helping them, but, I think they were quite comfortable with what they had. But I always remember my Taid, my granddad, used to be a captain in the Merchant Navy. He sailed as part of the Blue Funnel line, and he travelled the world, which is kind of crazy. I think I remember someone telling me that if you were a young lad growing up in that area, in the kind of Llyn Peninsula, when he did, really there weren't many options for what you would do with your life. You could either be a farmer, you could be a vicar, or you could go to sea. And he chose to go to sea. There's a photo still on the mantelpiece in my Nine and Taid's house. It's a kind of black and white photo, and it's of Taid as a young boy, young man, with his parents. I guess would have been my great grandparents. Yeah, that's how it works. And it's funny because obviously I never met those people, and obviously I know nothing about them to the extent other than I believe they were farmers. And honestly, you could tell. I mean, like, Taid's dad looked about 4 foot tall, but also nearly 4 foot wide. You got the impression he could have bench pressed a cow if needed. It just looked utterly hard as nails, and kind of like this ruddy, like North Welsh stock, like harsh landscape, kind of breeks tough people. And Taid, even as a young lad who can't have been more than 16 in the picture, looked, well, I mean, he was always a tall man, still is. But yeah, just looked powerfully built, and you could imagine him probably as a farmer. He had that kind of traditional build. But he instead he went to sea. And any young lad of that age wanting to do it went off to Liverpool, or rather they probably started in the Sea Cadets before heading up to Liverpool, which of course is a major dock, and all the big trading vessels of the Merchant Navy would be there. And he joined a company called the Blue Funnel as I guess I don't know what the lowest level would be, just as a able seaman, I guess, and then kind of headed off. And the way, he's not ever massively talked about his time at sea, but a few things I've learned have always been interesting. Like, I know he often said that the way it worked in the Merchant Navy was that you would have an agent of sorts. You'd go to port and you'd sign up with an agency and say, look, here are my papers. I'm a fully qualified, sailor. You need a crew, so I'm just putting my name forward. And then anytime a crew was needed, anytime a ship had a particular shipment to, transport, they'd put together a team. It's a bit like a movie. I remember talking to a guy who worked as an editor on several big kind of large-scale film productions. And he said that every time they made a film, they formed a limited company purely to handle the production of the film. So while working on, let's say Independence Day, as an editor, you would be hired by, say, Independence Day Limited, and then that would handle all the business side of things. And then when the movie was finished, the company would dissolve and wrap up, and everyone would, presumably get their final paychecks and then go their separate ways. But then you would keep a little notch on your belt forever saying that you'd worked on that movie, and your time with that company, even if it no longer existed, would be your CV. And it was the same with Taid and being in the Merchant Navy, and he would, sail on all manner of different ships, just wherever the business was. And of course, if you signed up to a contract that it's like, hey, we've got, 50,000 tons of timber that needs shipping from, Argentina to Tokyo, you're like, great, I'm on board, and they, you get your salary, you get lodgings on the ship, obviously, and then, you're gone for, months and months and months, however long that round trip takes. And then, who knows, even, you might get to Tokyo, finish your contract, and then hang around in port waiting for another contract to take you wherever. So he would be gone for months and months at a time. And it's really odd because he still gets, when you visit them and they're driving around, you take them driving around the area, and we go through like the little village of Four Crosses, which is where he grew up. And he's kind of saddled on either side by these giant kind of slate black mountains. But he often say like, that family of, the boy who lived there, he was my age, he went to sea, or that lad went to sea, or that lad went to sea. And he still gets phone calls on Christmas from people around the world. It's kind of crazy. Like he calls from New Zealand, calls from India, of people who served with him, or people who eventually served under him because he became a captain. But even if you were a captain, as my understanding was, you would have a contract, I think. I could be wrong in that regard, but I think it wasn't as simple as having your ship and taking it wherever. It was, you were working as part of a bigger company. You were working as the Blue Funnel line, and I believe you got deployed where necessary. But I remember it's just interesting all the stories he would tell, because I remember one of the most striking things he said was when he was very new to the game, when he was really just a seaman, just for kind of lowest level. They were in a storm, and due to essentially incompetence on the part of some people, the cargo they were shipping, which was great big barrels of chemicals, some various liquids, had not been secured properly to the storage area of the ship. So every time a wave hit the boat, these barrels would roll from one side to the other. And as they move, of course, they increased the rock of the boat. Their shifting weight made the boat just tip and bend and flex even more. And they realized that if it continues at this rate, they're going to sink. The boat is literally going to flip over. So the captain gave the order that they had to crack open the barrels, that they had to distribute the weight better. So Taid and his fellow low-level sailors were all ordered to grab axes run down to the cargo hold and hack open the barrels. That was their instruction. And Taid was saying something happened, like he was running down, and due to some last minute thing, he had to make a detour, like he had to go and grab something he'd forgotten. Maybe he'd misplaced his axe or something. And in the time it took him to get his axe and come back, or rather come down to the cargo hold, most of the people there were dead. Or if not dead, unconscious and in severe conditions, because no one had given any thought to the chemical that they were hacking open. I don't know what it was now, but these poor young men all ran down, hacked open these things, obeying orders, and were instantly doused in an incredibly toxic chemical. And I know Taid was saying his roommate died as well. And it was incredible. And he narrowly avoided that. He could very well have been one of them. And then I guess all this would be rather irrelevant. But he was saying the captain who had made those decisions and who had cost the lives of all those young men simply because of incompetence was a drinker, and it was kind of public knowledge that he was a drunk and not fit for his position. But such was the nature of the time, and maybe the nature of the company. It was just kind of brushed under the carpet and carried on. I don't think Taid ever knew what happened to him. Later on, in the dining room at Taid's house, they always had a kind of... Well, it's like a picture hanging on the wall, but really it was a 3D picture, and it was incredibly delicate, and it showed a woodland scene with deers and birds and trees, obviously. But it wasn't painted. It was all made of shells. It was all made of incredibly clean and polished, very ornate tropical shells, and which had been glued in place to make this kind of three-dimensional mural and then sealed behind glass. And, growing up, and we spent a lot of time visiting Taid, it was always just part of the background scenery. It was just an element of my childhood I could never forget. But I found out later that it had actually been presented to Taid as a gift, as a thank you gift, as a kind of award, really, by I want to say a Chinese shipping company. I could be mistaken. It was definitely in that region. If it wasn't China, it was one of its neighbouring countries. But they were sailing in that area, and this is where my geography falls apart entirely, but they were sailing in whatever stretch of water is in the South Asian region. And again, there was a storm, and this was a lot later in Taid's career, where he was a first mate, I think, on a boat. And they passed, they received a distress call in the middle of this storm. And this boat was sinking. It was in real danger of sinking, and I believe it was a Chinese shipping vessel. And so Taid's ship came to the rescue, and the captain ordered Taid, as first mate, to lead the rescue party to go across to save the crew. And so they all had to climb into, I don't even call them the not really escape boats, but like the kind, oh man, I'm drawing a mental blank. The little boats that hang on the side of the ship. Guys, going to drive me mad now. Anyway, because the sea was so choppy, and apparently this is standard practice, and I wasn't aware of this, they deliberately spilled oil onto the ocean. The idea being that the oil, being less dense than the water, would sit on top of it and actually calm the choppiness of the waves. And and then they were able to sail across and rescue the crew. And as a reward, Taid was presented by the owners of that vessel with this weird painting, which hung in their dining room. Yeah, he actually showed me a newspaper clipping of reporting on the event, and this was, this was kind of like the Welsh sailors newspaper printed for stranded Welsh sailors in, like Singapore or something like that. Yeah, and we had a full press record of the event, which was just seen as, not inherently heroic, just the nature of the job, and anyone would have done it for anyone. But still kind of cool. I remember Taid was always in my childhood quite a rule following gentleman. And I think this came from his past. Like, his life was very regimented. His life was very all done to, the ticking of a clock. And, even well into his retirement, he would get up and check out the shipping forecast and make notes on the weather patterns and currents and everything. And, certainly when he was a bit more able a few years back, he would run the house like a ship. He has slowed down a lot in recent years. And but when he was healthier, he was always working on something. He was always cleaning or scrubbing or fixing stuff. So I always thought of him as a kind of stickler for the rules, really. But I remember him telling me how, because he always wore glasses, I remember him telling me how there came a time when the new rules came in stating that captains, certainly in the blue funnel line, had to pass an eye exam. A revolutionary concept, but the idea that all captains had to have perfect eyesight. And he made use of a new technology called contact lenses to fake the test, which clearly was not conducted with a great degree of scrutiny, or anyone would have noticed he was wearing contact lenses. But I think he said he went to, this may have been in Singapore, I think this was in Japan, and he went to a Japanese eye doctor, and he got some contact lenses to then fake the test to prove that he didn't need glasses, which he entirely did. In hindsight, I guess it's lucky that he didn't cause any crashes, but he did wear glasses, and presumably only did not wear his glasses when people of a higher up nature were around. And as captain on his own ship, I guess who would question him? But he spent a lot of time in Japanese ports, actually. In fact, most of the time whenever I've been around the world on a holiday. Or if I've been travelling, more often than not, he'd have a story about the various ports he'd been to. I think when Lucy and I went to Denmark, he sailed to Copenhagen. Canada, he sailed to Vancouver. I'm not entirely sure if he sailed to Peru or not. But yeah, no, certainly down Indonesia way as well. But he spent a lot of time in Japanese ports. I think he said later on that many years later on another trip, he found himself back in Japan, and he went to visit the eye doctor who had given him the contact lenses, and he was now a furniture salesman or something like that. And anyway, of course, Taid got a very good deal off him, because I think Taid has always had a good eye for a bargain. And I think he ended up purchasing most of the furniture, which is now in Taid's house. We always had the most incredible chests, for lack of a better word, just for storing things. But I remember one in particular was almost jet black, like utterly black wood, polished within an inch of its life. It was like was like porcelain. It was stunningly beautiful, and an inset with, I guess, kind of shell and very like iridescent kind of patternings, and it was absolutely beautiful. I still have it actually. It's in Nanning Hyde's bedroom, and I think they got that from him as well, probably for a fraction of a fair price given Taid, but yeah. And I think at this time, interestingly, Japan was in the early days of its control by America, certainly in the post-war days. And I remember him saying that when they arrived in the port, there were, of course, American soldiers guarding the dock. And they were told that the crew, this, global crew, people from all nations, wouldn't be able to disembark. Like, they could unload their cargo, they could pick up new cargo, but due to the sanctions and controls on Japan post-war, no one was allowed to leave. So obviously, when darkness fell, they threw ropes overboard and snuck out to party, or in the case of Taid, buy full furniture sets, which would then populate a small house in North Wales for the following 50, 60 years. Although getting out of the boat is one thing, quite how they got back on past the American guards with 3 chests and numerous chairs is completely beyond me. I remember he also said at one point they sailed to America, and one of the crew had adopted a monkey at some point. Not a chimp, because obviously they're terrifying, but something smaller and cuter. And I think I remember him saying that when they got to America, because of quarantine laws, they weren't allowed to take the monkey on board. So I think they had to kill it. Something, obviously pretty horrendous. But I think he said they had to put the monkey in a bag and with stones and throw it overboard. A much simpler time. I also learned, one of those utterly useless facts, which is probably never going to come up again, but worth knowing, who knows, that a lot of ships, especially trading ships, are built to dimensions which are informally known as Panamax. So, which means, and I'm going to try and get this right, they are just short enough to sail under the Golden Gate Bridge. They are just narrow enough to go down the Panama Canal. And they are just long enough to do a 3-point turn in... which one is it? It's embarrassing. There's a bay. The idea is that money is equivalent to the amount of stock you can shift. So a smart businessman might be like, why can't we just make the boats bigger and bigger and bigger? However, there is a limit, because if you make your boat too big, then it's not going to be able to get into 3 of the major ports that trading vessels need to go through. So hence, if you make your ship too tall, you're not going to be able to get into San Francisco because you can't go under the Golden Gate Bridge. If you make it too wide, you're not going to be able to sail through the Panama Canal. And if you make it too long, you're not going to be able to have a turning circle that can fit inside this other bay. And that's killing me now because I can't remember what it is. I think he said at one point he was serving on a ship which was heading towards the Panama Canal. And Taid, who was not a captain at this point in his career, raised the issue, why are we trying to sail through the Panama Canal? Our ship is too wide. We can't physically fit through the Panama Canal. And he was saying, and nobody listened to him, and they got to the Panama Canal, and rightly so, they were turned away because the ship could not physically fit through the Panama Canal. Even ships that do fit barely have a few feet of clearance on either side. This one was just too wide. And the goalposts do not move in this instance. The Panama Canal cannot get wider or narrower as the mood demands. This is just a fact of life. And I think because of that, they had to make a massive detour. So yeah, don't know why I felt compelled to share these sailing stories, but there we go. They've just been on my mind lately. It's kind of odd, really, and I guess the irony is that for a man who had travelled most of the world, for a man who had stayed in, various places around the world, and Taid, even now, does not have much of an adventurous palate, certainly when it comes to eating or drinking. You think you've been to Louisiana, you've been to South America, you've been to Japan, Russia, everywhere. And still, in any situation, what he really wants to eat is some nice white fish, potatoes, soup, and then maybe some apple pie at the end. He is an astonishingly unadventurous diner. I know we take them out to eat when we go to visit, and it's not even a joke now. It's just a fact of life. It's like, how can we get some white fish for Taid? It's very interesting. I guess you'd often think that travel would broaden the mind. Maybe it did. Maybe I'm saying this with the luxury of not having 90 odd years behind me, but yeah, maybe he did try everything, and maybe he decided there was one thing he really liked. Maybe, maybe he didn't try everything. Maybe, he's tired of being adventurous. And he's like, look, now, crying out loud, I'm 90 or so. I need, I'm pushing 90. I just need what I like. I don't know. It's also interesting. We never really knew why kind of Taid's career came to an end. I think he retired sometime in the early 80s before I was born. And yeah, I don't think we'll ever get the full story. I think there's an element of mental health as well. I think, he was born of an age where these problems maybe could be diagnosed, but they were never really talked about or given the care they needed. But because truth be told, Taid does suffer from depression, a fact that's not not helped by his advanced years and his health, be it his hips. But it's odd in a way. I often wonder what it would be like if he'd got some help earlier. I remember I was always told stories about Taid growing up on a farm in North Wales, which had all the hallmarks of some kind of classic Victorian boy's own adventure, running around fields, being chased by bulls, that kind of thing. But he had, during the Second World War, he was too young to serve, but a young lad from London was evacuated to his farm and became and spent several years growing up with Taid, and they were good friends. And after the war, that lad, whose name was Bill, his family emigrated to Canada. His elder sister had married a Canadian airman, and she'd moved to Canada and then written back and said, look, it's great here, you should all come. And they did. And, he left to start this whole new life in Canada. And apparently that was considered the end of it. They would never see each other again until, I think, some point in the very late 70s, or possibly late 70s, I think, Will Hoskins suddenly turned up on the door of Nyland Taid's weird old mountain house, which they've now had to move out of, but it was the most incredible castle to explore as a kid. It was just this weird 3-story building called Pennant, kind of straddling the side of a hillside. I think the garden was about 45 degrees, and it was absolutely amazing. Far too impractical for them to live in as they got older, but something I loved visiting as a kid. And Will Hoskins just turned up on the door, wearing jeans, which I think I think I remember dining outside finding particularly shocking. This is, Taid being a man who's never wore jeans in his life. And, long hair, it being the 70s, big shirt, jeans, and was like, hey, I'm Will Hoskins. I've not seen you since the war, and I'm back in the UK, and I've tracked you down. And since then, they had sporadic meetings. Like Nallingside went to Canada to visit him. He came over a couple of times to visit them. Certainly in my lifetime, he came over, and we met him when I was younger. It's interesting. Like in later life, I think he'd become incredibly nostalgic for his youth in Canada, his youth in Wales. He had some kids. He wasn't especially close to them anymore. He'd had a marriage that had ended. When I went to Canada, the first time round, when I spent a year in Canada with my friend Titch, at one point we were living in Calgary, which, with all due respect to Calgary, is in the middle of nowhere. It is in the middle of oil and farming country. It's just thousands and thousands of miles of nothing on either side. And I took a bus. I took like a very long bus journey out of town to another town called Penticton, which I think was about 6 or 8 hours away. And Penticton, and if Calgary was in the middle of nowhere, then Penticton was incredibly out there. We'd actually stopped by twice. When the four of us at the time, it was me, Titch, Sally, our friend, and Dev, our Canadian friend, who I'd met while working at Starbucks. And we somehow decided to go from Calgary to Vancouver. But on the way, before moving to Vancouver, we were going to stop via various places. We were going to do like a bus tour, like a 5 or 6 day bus tour to take in the surroundings. And one of the stops was in Penticton. And everyone was like, why are we going to Penticton? There's nothing in Penticton. But I was like, there is something in Penticton. And it would be cool to go because my granddad's friend lives there. So I found myself in Penticton of an afternoon. And I had no contact details for Will Hoskins, but through kind of calls home and then emails and everything, I think my mom was able to get a message to Will Hoskins that I was in for a few hours. And at the time, because we'd given up hope of trying to find Will Hoskins, at the time we were up in like a winery on the edge of town. Go figure, because we were like, what else are we going to do? There's a massive lake in Penticton. Penticton is divided halfway between a very aging, elderly population. It's like a retirement town, and also like a young kind of thrill-seeking kind of town. There's there's a big lake there where there's water sports, and the lake is kind of flat on one side, and that's where the town is. And then great big desert-like hills rise up on either side. It's very desert-like or prairie-like. And we'd gone walking up the side of one of these flanking hills to go to a winery, because we were like, well, what else are we going to do? Like, let's go get some wine. So we went and we had some wine, and it was lovely, and we were getting a little tipsy, if not more than a little tipsy. And then I got word that Will Hoskins was kind of in town, and then we had like half an hour before our bus, or we were sadly it was like ships in the night. We had like a brief window to kind of meet, and we started down the hillside again. And I was hurrying a bit, and I was a bit drunk, and I was like, oh grief, I've got to get back and try and see Will, because when is this going to happen again? And as we were coming back and we were trotting down the hill, we passed like a bunch of random guys who were playing golf into the lake and drinking wine and just kind of just smacking golf balls into the lake like you do. So I left. I was like, guys, this is actually really cool, but I have a date with destiny, so I had to leg it down the hill, and I left Titch, Sally, and Dev playing golf with these guys and drinking wine. And as I made it down to the bus station, and I met Will Hoskins and his friend Mary, who had come to kind of see me. And I think we had about 20 minutes or half an hour of just chatting, and we took a photo before we had to hop in the bus and head off again. And I agreed I would come back. I would make a visit from Vancouver. So, a few weeks or months later, once we were settled in Vancouver, I got a bus for a couple of days in Penticton with Will Hoskins. And it was really weird. It was kind of nice, but it was weird at the same time. I felt very sorry for Will. I think he was lonely, and I think he'd reached a point in his life where, look, he'd ended up in Penticton, which was really the end of the world, it felt like. And, he was nostalgic for a time when he'd, been young in Wales, a time which I think he equated with a lot of happiness. And, but we had a nice weekend, and we chatted, and we explored Penticton, and he took me to a variety show on a they had like these paddle boats which used to go around the lake, and now one of them had been beached and turned into a kind of hotel/venue. And in fact, Taid used to have and still do to this day, a kind of placemat in the spare bedroom where we stay when we go to visit them, showing that boat on the shores of Penticton. And and it was crazy. And for this little weekend, I got a proper little slice of Canadiana, where I listened to Canadian comedians telling Canadian jokes. And just as growing up, we'd always have jokes. You'd always have a joke about the Irish. The Irish were always the butt of every joke. In Canada, it was the exact same jokes, only they were making fun of Newfoundland, of the Newfies. Like, I guess every culture has a smaller subset considered the country folk, who it's fun to make fun of, which is rich coming from someone who grew up in Gloucestershire, I appreciate. And we just chatted about things. And it was sad in a way. Like, he'd lived around Canada, like he'd worked on the oil fields. I think he'd worked as a builder for a bit as well. And now, he'd kind of ended up in Penticton. And he actually had written an autobiography, kind of self-published, and I think I have a copy somewhere. But and then we parted ways, and off we went. And Will had always been a kind of dedicated amateur filmmaker, really to the extent of, in the early days, pre-YouTube, he was maybe too old for the revolution of, do-it-yourself film production which had come. But, very much like he would, film little home videos, little travel logs. He'd set them to music, he'd put them on DVDs, and he'd post them to Taid. And, I often think it was kind of sad that Taid and him couldn't reconnect more in later life. I guess too much kind of water had passed under the bridge, and they were too kind of different, I guess. They'd lived very different lives, and Taid was this big kind of stoic, kind of, salt of the earth, former sea captain fellow, and Will had obviously, Will Hoskins, had lived a more kind of varied, hippie-esque life, I guess. And kind of, wore jeans, had long hair. In his later life, of course, they look no different to each other. They both, looked like any man in their 60s or 70s. But I guess the difference in time and, difference in geography had meant they could never reconnect as much as maybe Will Hoskins would have liked, which is a shame, because I think, certainly as Taid's health has kind of declined, I think, he could have used a connection like that. And certainly as Will, got older and kind of, a bit more isolated, and maybe, I'm sure he was desperate for a connection which just couldn't be returned, sadly. And Will Hoskins has now actually passed away, which is very, very sad, obviously. And I hope, I hope in his later life he got certainly in his last days, he got a bit of closure. I remember one of the last kind of images I had of him, because we we parted ways, and really we only spent like a weekend together. But he was a nice guy. He was just a little lonely. And I remember a year or two later, I was visiting Nine and Taid, and they'd sent Will had sent them a little DVD of some footage he'd made. And of course we had to help them play it, show them how to use the DVD player. And we watched this little video, which, was charmingly amateur. It was just, Will with an old handheld camera and, some guitar music he'd found playing over top. And the last kind of footage was a family reunion, and he'd, gone to a dinner with his children, children who are mostly estranged, really. And I know one of his daughters had a lot of problem with drugs, and he saw his grandchildren, and he saw some of his children, and for a little moment everyone looked quite happy. And I hope things improved for him in those last few days, really. But yeah, I have no idea why I started telling this story. I don't know. Just kind of sad, really. I'd like to say it's an older generation thing, but I don't know, maybe we're all just as messed up in our own way. You just kind of hope that the only thing that will really help us is being able to talk a bit more. I often think that would have helped Taid a lot earlier. It maybe would have helped Will. But as it happens, Nine and Taid are still with us, and I'm very grateful. And very much hoping that they will be able to attend our wedding next year, where we are already making as many plans as possible to make them comfy. The same for Lucy's gran and her nan. We really would love that generation to be there, and we're going to, they are obviously quite old now, and we're going to do everything we can to make them comfy, including being sure to serve some kind of whitefish at the wedding dinner, or failing that, I don't know, white chicken, something plain. But yeah, thank you for listening, guys. As ever, a random episode, but I will see you again in a fortnight for another episode of Morning Coffee.